They laughed when he chose her, and by sunrise, not a single man in that town could meet his eyes. The dust hung low in the afternoon heat, drifting slow across the wooden walkway like it had all the time in the world, and Ethan Cole stood there with his hat pulled low, boots planted firm, while the line of women stretched out beside the old trading post. Some young, some tired, some trying too hard to be seen, and then there was her, Nahima, standing apart, taller than any man there by an inch or two, shoulders broad, arms marked with faint scars that told stories no one bothered to ask about, her dark hair braided tight, her gaze steady but distant, like she wasn't waiting to be chosen because she already knew she wouldn't be. The town had its rules, unspoken but sharp as barbed wire, and one of them was simple. Men chose what made their lives easier, not harder. Men chose what others approved of, not what made them uncomfortable. And yet Ethan stepped forward without hesitation, boots creaking against the planks, passing by every smile, every hopeful glance, every whispered promise, until he stopped in front of the one woman everyone pretended not to see. And for a moment, even the wind seemed to pause. Someone chuckled from behind him, low and mean. Another voice followed, louder this time. "You sure about that, Cole?" But Ethan didn't turn, didn't explain, didn't offer them anything at all, just lifted his chin slightly and said one word, calm and final, her-like. It settled everything. Nahima didn't react the way they expected. No surprise, no gratitude, just a slight narrowing of her eyes, as if she was measuring him the same way he had just chosen her. And when she stepped forward, the boards beneath her feet gave a soft groan, a quiet reminder of her presence, her weight, her reality, something no one there could ignore no matter how much they tried. The laughter came quicker then, spreading through the crowd like a bad habit. Bets whispered in, dollars and cheap confidence, men shaking their heads, women looking away, because in their eyes Ethan Cole had just made the kind of choice that marked a man, not as brave, but as foolish, and foolish men didn't last long out here. The sun dipped lower as they walked away together, side by side but not touching, shadows stretching long across the dirt road, neither of them speaking, because some silences carried more weight than words ever could. And when they reached the small cabin at the edge of town, with the land turned rough and the fences leaned like they were tired of standing, Ethan pushed the door open and stepped inside without looking back, trusting she would follow, and she did, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, like the world outside had just been shut out for good. Inside, the air smelled of dry wood and old leather, a single oil lamp casting long shadows across the walls, and for a while, neither of them moved, just two strangers standing in the same space, bound by a choice no one understood, not even them, until Nahima finally spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying something older than the town they had just left behind. "You always choose what others fear," and Ethan, without turning, without hesitation, answered just as quietly, "Only when it matters." And somewhere outside, far beyond the reach of the fading light, something unseen began to move, slow and deliberate, like a story that had been waiting a long time to be told. The night settled heavy around the cabin, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and made every small sound feel louder than it should, the faint creak of wood, the low whistle of wind slipping through the cracks, and Ethan Cole sat at the rough table with his hands resting flat against the surface, not tense, not relaxed, just steady, while across the room Nahima remained near the door, not like a guest, not like a wife, more like someone deciding whether this place was worth staying in at all. The oil lamp flickered between them, casting shadows that stretched and shifted across her face, revealing strength in the lines of her jaw, in the stillness of her posture, and something else beneath it, something guarded, something that had learned long ago not to expect kindness without a cost. Ethan reached for a tin cup, poured water from a dented kettle, and set it on the table without looking at her. A simple gesture, nothing more. But in a world like this, small things carried weight, and after a moment she stepped forward, each step quiet but certain, the floor answering with a soft groan under her boots, and she took the cup without a word, her fingers brushing the rim, Not his hand, never his hand. Not yet. They stood there like that. Two people bound by a choice that neither of them had explained. And outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the lantern light, a horse shifted in the dark. Then another, distant, almost too faint to notice unless you were listening for it. Nahima lowered the cup slowly, her eyes lifting toward Ethan, not questioning, not accusing, simply observing. And she said, "You do not ask who I am." Her voice calm, carrying a rhythm that did not belong to the town, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him, his gaze still not meeting hers directly. "If you wanted me to know you, would tell me," he replied, just as steady, and for the first time, something changed in her expression. Not softness, not quite, but the edge of something that might have been respect. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the walls like a warning, and the faint sound of laughter drifted from the direction of the town, distant but clear enough to carry meaning. Men still talking, still placing bets, still convinced they understood the story they had just witnessed. And Ethan let out a slow breath, not bothered, not proud, just aware, because he had lived long enough to know that the loudest voices were often the least certain. Nahima turned slightly toward the small window, her eyes narrowing as if measuring the darkness beyond it, and her hand moved to her neck where a thin leather cord rested against her skin, something small hanging from it, something she kept hidden beneath the fabric of her dress. And for a moment her fingers tightened around it before she let it fall. "Again, they will not stop," she said quietly, not looking at him now, her voice lower, more distant, and Ethan followed her gaze toward the window, though he saw nothing but shadows and dust carried on the wind. "They usually do not," he answered, simple as that. And there was no fear in his tone, no challenge either, just acceptance of the kind of life he had chosen long before this night. The cabin fell silent again, heavier this time, as if something unseen had stepped closer, and far out beyond the edge of town, beyond the fields and the broken fences, a line of riders moved through the dark, slow and deliberate, not racing, not hiding, just coming, their silhouettes blending with the night itself. And though neither Ethan nor Nahima spoke of it, both of them felt it, like a storm that had not yet reached the sky above them, but was already on its way. The first light of morning did not arrive all at once. It crept slowly across the land like something careful not to wake what slept beneath it, pale gold stretching over dry grass, touching the edges of fences, slipping through the cracks in the cabin walls, until it found Ethan Cole already awake, standing by the window with his hat in his hands, not wearing it yet, just holding it like a man who understood that some days required a different kind of readiness. Behind him, Nahima had not moved. From where she sat against the far wall, her back straight, her eyes open, as if sleep had never come to claim her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because the silence now was not empty. It was waiting. Then it came, faint at first, a rhythm beneath the quiet, steady and distant, the sound of hooves touching earth in unison, not hurried, not scattered, but measured, controlled, like something that had purpose and did not need to rush to prove it. And Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, just enough to listen, just enough to confirm what he already knew. Nahima stood then, slow, deliberate, her gaze shifting toward the door before it reached him. And her voice, when it came, was softer than before, not weaker, but heavier. "You hear them," she said, not a question, and Ethan placed his hat on his head at last, pulling the brim low. "I do," he answered, just as quietly, and there was no fear between them, only the weight of something that had finally arrived, outside. The air felt different, cooler than it should have been, carrying a stillness that pressed against the skin, and as Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the boards beneath his boots answering with a low creak, the horizon revealed itself not with noise, but with presence, figures forming along the ridge, one by one, then more, until the line stretched wider than the eye could comfortably follow, riders mounted and still, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun, feathers and braids catching light in a way that turned them into something more than men, something older, something that belonged to the land itself. They did not move closer, not yet, They simply stood, watching, waiting, and the town behind Ethan began to stir. Doors opening, voices rising, confusion first, then realization, and then the kind of silence that follows when people understand they have been wrong about something they cannot undo. Nahima stepped out beside him, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carried something new. Now, not guarded, not distant, but certain, and she did not look at the riders. Not immediately. She looked at Ethan, measuring him once more, and in that moment the distance between them felt smaller than it had the night before. One rider broke from the line then, moving forward at a pace that carried no threat, only intent, his horse stepping carefully down the slope, and as he drew closer, the details became clear, age in the lines of his face, strength in the way he held himself. A presence that did not need to be announced to be understood, and when he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped, dismounted with slow precision, and for a brief moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan did not reach for anything, did not step back. He simply stood where he was, hands at his sides, steady as ever, and Nahima moved then, one step forward, just enough to stand beside him fully, not behind, not ahead, but equal, and the man before them lowered his gaze, not in submission, not in defeat, but in recognition, something quiet, something that carried more weight than any word spoken aloud, and the town behind them, the same town that had laughed only hours before, watched in silence as the story they thought they understood began to unfold into something far beyond their reach. The man who had stepped forward did not rush his words, did not fill the air with anything unnecessary. He simply stood there for a moment with the morning light behind him, letting the silence stretch until it carried its own meaning. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, shaped by years that had taught him when to speak and when to let the world listen instead. "You chose her," he said, his English clear, deliberate, and though the words were simple, they carried weight. That settled over the yard like dust after a long ride. Ethan Cole gave a slight nod. Nothing more, no explanation offered, no defense needed, and the man's gaze shifted to Nahima, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, as if confirming something he had already known long before this moment. And Nahima met his eyes without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, yet there was something different now, something that no longer held distance, but connection, quiet and unspoken. Behind the man, the line of riders remained still, not one shifting in their saddle, not one breaking formation, and the town that watched from a distance began to feel smaller, its voices quieter, its certainty unraveling thread by thread. The man reached into the fold of his coat slowly, his movement careful, not because he feared what stood before him, but because he respected it, and when his hand emerged, it held a small object, worn by time, a piece of leather tied with a thin cord, something simple, something that might have been overlooked by anyone who did not understand its meaning, and he extended it forward, not toward Ethan, but toward Nahima, and for a moment she did not take it, her eyes resting on the object as if it carried memories that had not been spoken aloud. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance, her hand rising to meet his, and when her fingers touched the leather, something passed between them, not visible, not loud, but real, like a story. Continuing where it had once been paused, Ethan watched without interruption, his gaze steady, his stance unchanged, because whatever this was, it was not something that required him to lead, only to stand and witness. The man lowered his hand once the object was returned, and then, slowly, he turned his attention back to Ethan, his expression neither harsh nor soft, but certain. "She is not what they think," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only truth, the kind that did not need to be defended. And Ethan answered in the same quiet tone, "I know." And for the first time, a faint shift crossed the man's face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something close enough to both that it changed the air between them. Behind them, a few townspeople had stepped closer, drawn by curiosity stronger than their caution, and one voice, low but not quiet enough, broke the silence. "What is this supposed to be?" and though the words were not meant for anyone in particular, they carried the same doubt that had filled the town the day before. And the man heard it, turned his head, just enough to acknowledge its presence, but did not answer it, because some things were not meant to be explained to those who had not earned the understanding. Instead, he stepped back a single measured step and lifted his hand slightly, a signal so small it might have been missed by anyone not paying attention. But the riders saw it, every one of them, and as one they shifted not forward, not closer, but simply adjusting, like a breath taken together. And in that moment, the weight of what stood before the town became undeniable. Not a threat, not a show of force, but a presence that demanded recognition. Nahima turned her head slightly toward Ethan then, her voice barely above a whisper, yet clear enough for him alone. "Now they will see," she said, and Ethan, without looking away from the man before him, answered just as quietly, "They already are, and somewhere behind them." The town that had once laughed found itself standing in silence, not because it had been told to, but because it no longer knew how to speak. The air did not move the way it usually did after something important had happened. It did not rush back in to fill the space. It stayed still, heavy, as if even. The wind understood that this moment belonged to something older than the town behind them, and Ethan Cole stood where he had been, boots planted in the dry earth, feeling the weight of 100 eyes pressing against his back, though none of them dared come closer than the edge of his land. The man before him turned slightly then, not away, but enough to shift the moment forward, his presence still calm, still grounded, and he spoke again, slower this time. "For many seasons, we have watched the men of this town," his gaze drifting past Ethan toward the distant buildings, the wooden signs, the people standing frozen in their doorways. "We have seen how they look at what they do not understand." And there was no anger in his voice, only a quiet observation that carried more truth than accusation ever could. Nahima remained beside Ethan, her hand now resting lightly against the small leather piece she had taken, her thumb tracing its edge as if remembering something long buried. And when the man looked back at her, his expression softened just enough to reveal something beneath his authority, something personal. "You were sent away so they would not see what you carry," he said. And this time the words were not for the town, not for Ethan, but for her alone, and she answered with a slight nod, her voice barely above a breath. They saw only what they wanted, and in that quiet exchange, a truth unfolded that no one in the town had ever cared to imagine. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not uneasy, but aware that the story moving around him was no longer about choice alone. It was about consequence, about what came after a man decided to stand where others would not. And he spoke then, his voice steady as ever. "You did not come here for them." And the man's eyes returned to him, sharp, measuring, before he answered, "No." A single word, simple, clear, "We came because of you." And that was when the silence behind Ethan broke, not with noise, but with movement. A few townspeople stepping closer despite themselves, drawn by something they could not name. Curiosity mixed with unease, and among them a man who had laughed the loudest the day before now stood with his hat in his hands, uncertain what to do with them. The riders behind the leader remained still, their presence unchanging, yet the weight of them seemed to grow with every passing second, not as a threat, but as a reminder, and the leader took one more step forward, closing the space between himself and Ethan just enough to make the moment feel personal, deliberate. "You chose her when no one else would," he said, his voice low, carrying something close to respect now. "Not for what she looks like, not for what they said she was." His gaze flickered briefly toward the town again, then back. "But because you saw something they refused to see." And Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not have words, but because he understood that some things did not need to be spoken twice. And when he finally did speak, it was quiet, almost simple. "I chose what felt right." And the man studied him for a long moment, as if weighing that answer against something deeper, something older than either of them. And then he gave a slight nod. Not dramatic, not grand, just enough to mark the moment as complete. Nahima stepped forward then, just a fraction, her voice steady, her eyes fixed ahead. "Then let them understand," she said, not asking, not demanding, but stating something that could no longer be avoided. and the man turned his head once more toward the line of riders, his hand lifting again in that same small, precise signal. And this time, the riders began to move. Not toward the town, not in any show of force, but slowly, deliberately, forming a wide arc behind Ethan and Nehema, enclosing the space not as a trap, but as a statement. And the message was clear to anyone watching, clear enough that no one spoke it aloud, that what stood here now was not about fear, not about power, but about something the town had forgotten how to recognize, and Ethan Cole, standing at the center of it, finally understood that what Nehema had brought into his life was not trouble, not burden, but a truth that would not be ignored, no matter how many people had once laughed at it. The movement of the riders did not stir or dust the way a charge would. It carried no urgency, no threat, only intention. And as they formed that wide arc behind Ethan and Nehema, the land itself seemed to shift its balance, as if something long out of place had quietly returned to where it belonged. The town felt it before it understood it. Men who had spoken loudly the day before now stood with their shoulders tight, their hands unsure of where to rest, some gripping their hats, others letting them hang forgotten at their sides. And no one laughed anymore, not because they had been told to stop, but because the reason to laugh had vanished without leaving a trace. Ethan remained still, his gaze moving slowly across the line of riders, not counting them, not measuring strength, but recognizing something else entirely, a discipline, a unity that did not need to prove itself. And beside him, Nehema stood taller than before, not because her body had changed, but because the space around her had. The weight of her presence now understood in a way it had not been the day before. The leader stepped slightly to the side, giving the line behind him room to be seen more clearly, and his voice came again, not raised, not forced, but carrying far enough that even those at the edge of town could hear it if they chose to listen. "You measure people by what you see," he said, his eyes sweeping across the distant faces, "and you forget to ask what stands behind it." And the words settled into the silence like stones in a still water, rippling outward without needing to be repeated. Nehema turned then, not toward Ethan, but toward the town, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and for the first time she stepped forward alone, one step beyond the line of the porch, placing herself where every eye could find her. And though no one spoke, every person watching felt the shift, felt the weight of her presence land where judgment had once stood so easily. She reached up slowly, her fingers moving to the leather cord at her neck, and with a single deliberate motion she pulled it free, letting the small object it held fall in her palm, the same worn piece that had passed between her and the leader moments before, and she lifted it just enough for the light to catch it. Not as a display, not as a challenge, but as a truth offered without demand. The leader watched her, not guiding, not interrupting, because this moment belonged to her now, and Ethan did not move either, his role already chosen, his place already taken, and all that remained was to stand and allow what needed to be seen to reveal itself. Nehema's voice came then, calm, steady, carrying across the open space without strain. "This was given to my mother when she was dying," she said, her words clear, each one placed with care, "by a man who did not belong to our people." And a murmur passed through the town, not loud, not disruptive, but enough to show that something had reached them, something had unsettled the shape of the story they had built for themselves. She lowered the object slightly, her gaze still fixed ahead. She was not turned away, she continued. She was not judged by what she looked like, or where she came from. And for a brief moment her eyes shifted, not fully, but enough to find Ethan at the edge of her vision. She was seen, and the word carried more weight than anything that had been said before it. The leader inclined his head once, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth being spoken, and the riders behind him remained still, their presence unchanged, yet somehow even stronger now, because what stood before the town was no longer just a line of figures on horseback. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to every choice they had made and every judgment they had cast. Ethan finally took a slow breath, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood that what had been set in motion the moment he spoke a single word the day before had now reached its turning point. And as the silence settled once more, deeper than before, heavier, undeniable, it became clear to everyone watching that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of understanding they had never expected to face. The words did not fade when Nehima finished speaking. They lingered in the air like dust that refused to settle, and for a long moment no one in the town moved, not because they had been stopped, but because something inside them had shifted in a way they did not yet understand. Ethan Cole stood just behind her now, not stepping forward, not taking a moment from her, but close enough that his presence remained steady, like a line drawn quietly in the sand that no one dared cross anymore, and the riders behind them held their formation without effort, their stillness speaking louder than any display of force ever could. One of the townsmen, the same one who had laughed the loudest the day before, took a slow step forward, his boots dragging slightly through the dirt as if the ground itself had grown heavier beneath him. And he removed his hat with hands that no longer seemed certain of themselves, his voice low, rough, not carrying the same confidence it once had. "We did not know," he said, and the words sounded smaller than he expected, like they had lost something on the way out. Nehima did not turn to face him. She did not acknowledge the apology directly, because this was not about one man or one voice. It was about something deeper, something that could not be undone with a single sentence. And instead she lowered the small leather piece back against her chest, letting it rest where it had before, her hand lingering there for just a second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself in something that did not depend on their understanding. The leader watched the exchange in silence, his expression unchanged, but his eyes carried a quiet approval, not of the apology itself, but of the moment it represented. And he spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Knowing is not the same as seeing," he said, his gaze steady on the man who had spoken, "and seeing is not the same as understanding." And the man lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition of something he could not argue against. A soft wind moved across the land then, the first true movement since the riders had arrived, lifting the edges of coats, stirring the dust in slow circles, and Ethan shifted his weight just enough to feel it pass, his eyes moving from the town back to the horizon, then to Nehima, and for the first time since the morning began, he spoke her name, quiet, steady, Nehima, and she turned her head just enough to meet his gaze, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge him. And there was something different there now, something that had not existed the night before, a recognition that did not need to be explained. The leader stepped back then, giving space not only to them, but to the moment itself, and he raised his hand once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and the riders behind him responded in the same silent unity, not by advancing, not by retreating, but by lowering their heads. Just slightly, a gesture so subtle that it might have been missed by anyone not paying attention. But to those who understood, it carried meaning deeper than any spoken word, a sign not of submission, but of respect, offered freely and without condition. The town saw it, even if they did not fully grasp it, and something inside them shifted again, something quieter this time, less about fear, more about reflection. And the man who had stepped forward took another breath, slower now, steadier, as if trying to match the rhythm of something larger than himself. Nehima turned back toward the horizon then, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded, and the weight that had once made her seem out of place now felt like something else entirely, something that belonged exactly where it stood. And Ethan remained beside her, not above, not ahead, but equal, his choice no longer something to be questioned, but something that had already begun to change the shape of the world around them. And as the light of the morning grew stronger, stretching across the land and touching every face that watched, it became clear that what had begun as a single decision, spoken in one quiet word, had become something far greater than any of them had expected, something that could not be undone, and more importantly, something that would not be forgotten. The bowed heads did not rise immediately, and that small delay carried more meaning than any grand gesture ever could, because it told the town something they had never taken the time to learn, that respect was not given in noise. It was given in stillness, in restraint, in the quiet decision to acknowledge what stood before you without needing to control it. Ethan Cole watched the line of riders with a calm that did not come from ignorance, but from understanding, the kind that grows slowly over years of choosing silence over pride. And beside him, Nahima remained unmoved, her presence grounded in a way that no longer felt separate from the land around them, but part of it, like she had always belonged there even when no one had been willing to see it. The leader lifted his head first, slow and deliberate, his gaze returning to Ethan. Not as a test, but as a conclusion, and he spoke once more, his voice carrying the final weight of what had been set in motion. A man is known by what he stands beside. He said, each word measured, each one placed with care. And today you have shown us where you stand, and Ethan did not answer with words this time. He only gave a slight nod, because anything more would have made the moment smaller than it deserved to be. Behind them, the town shifted again, but this time it was different. Not driven by confusion or unease, but by something closer to realization. Men lowering their gazes, women stepping back from the edges of their doorways, children who had once stared with curiosity now standing quiet, sensing that what they were witnessing mattered in ways they could not yet name. Nahima turned her head slightly toward the leader, her voice calm, steady. "You did not need to come," she said, not as a challenge, but as a truth. And the leader's expression softened in a way that only she seemed to fully understand. "No," he replied, "but we chose to," and there was something in that answer that echoed Ethan's own choice from the day before, something that tied the two moments together across distance and time, a quiet thread of intention that did not depend on approval. The riders behind him began to shift then, not breaking formation, but easing, their posture relaxing just enough to signal that what had been required of them was complete, and the land itself seemed to respond, the tension that had held the morning in place beginning to loosen, the wind returning in soft breaths that moved across the grass and stirred the dust in gentle spirals. Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding, not out of relief, but out of recognition that something had passed, something that could not be undone, and he turned his gaze toward Nahima again, meeting her eyes fully this time, not measuring, not questioning, just seeing, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fall quiet in a different way, not heavy, not waiting, but settled. The leader stepped back once more, creating space not just physically, but symbolically, and he raised his hand one final time, the signal clear, unmistakable, and the riders responded as one, turning their horses with the same quiet precision they had shown in their arrival. Not rushing, not lingering, simply leaving, their silhouettes beginning to stretch back across the horizon as the sun climbed higher. The town watched them go in silence, no one calling out, no one daring to break the moment with unnecessary words, because they understood now, at least in part, that what had happened here was not meant to be explained away or reduced to a story told over drinks. It was something that required reflection, something that would stay with them long after the riders had disappeared from sight. Nahima remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, her gaze following the line of riders until the last one faded into the distance. And then she lowered her eyes briefly, not in sorrow, not in loss, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if closing a chapter that had never fully belonged to this place. Ethan stepped down from the porch then, the wood beneath his boots giving a soft creak, and he moved to stand beside her again, not saying anything at first, because there were moments when words only got in the way, and this was one of them. And as the wind brushed past them both, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage, it became clear that what remained now was not what the town had expected, not a burden, not a mistake, but something far more difficult to define, something that would reveal itself not in a single moment, but in all the ones that would follow. The last rider disappeared over the ridge without a sound, and for a while the land felt wider than it had before, as if something heavy had been lifted without anyone noticing the exact moment it left. And Ethan Cole stood there in the open yard with the sun climbing higher over his shoulder, watching the empty horizon like a man who understood that what had passed was not the end of something, but the beginning of what would follow. Behind him, the town did not return to itself right away. No doors slammed. No laughter crept back in. Only quiet movement, slow steps retreating, people turning away not out of dismissal, but because they no longer knew where to place themselves in a story that had shifted beyond their control. And the man who had stepped forward earlier lingered for a moment longer than the others, his hat still in his hands, his eyes lowered not in shame alone, but in thought, before he finally turned and walked back toward the wooden buildings that now looked smaller than they had the day before. Nehima remained still beside Ethan, her gaze no longer following the riders, but resting on the land itself, the stretch of dry earth, the leaning fence, the distant line where sky met ground. And for a long moment she said nothing, as if listening to something deeper than sound, something carried in the wind that brushed lightly against her hair and the edges of her clothing. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the boards of the porch behind him giving a faint creak as he stepped closer, not intruding, not pressing, just closing the distance enough to share the space. And after a while he spoke, his voice quiet, steady. "They will talk." And Nehima's lips moved just slightly, not quite a smile, not quite dismissal. "They always do," she answered, her tone carrying no bitterness, only certainty. And he gave a small nod, because that was something he understood well. The sun continued to rise, warming the ground, pulling the chill out of the morning air, and with it came the slow return of ordinary sound. A door opening somewhere in the distance, a horse shifting. In its stall, the faint clink of metal against wood, life resuming not as it had been, but as something slightly altered, something that carried the echo of what had just occurred. Nehima turned then, not toward the town, but toward the cabin, her steps measured, her posture unchanged. And as she reached the doorway, she paused for a brief second, her hand resting against the frame, her fingers brushing the worn wood as if acknowledging a place that had, in its own quiet way, become hers as well. And Ethan watched her, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with the same steady presence he had shown from the beginning. Because whatever came next was not something to be rushed. She stepped inside, the shadow of the doorway closing around her, and the interior of the cabin caught the morning light in thin lines that stretched across the floor and the table, illuminating the small details that had once felt like his alone, now shared without needing to be spoken. Ethan followed a moment later, his boots soft against the threshold, and he removed his hat as he entered, setting it down on the same table where it had rested the night before. The gesture simple, familiar, grounding, and for a moment they stood in that quiet space again, the outside world held at a distance by wood and shadow. Nehima moved toward the small window, her eyes scanning the land once more. And then she spoke, her voice softer now, not because it lacked strength, but because it no longer needed to carry it outward. "You did not ask for this," she said, and Ethan leaned slightly against the wall, his arms loose at his sides. "No," he answered, just as simply, and after a brief pause he added, "But I chose it." And that was the difference, the thing that had set everything in motion, the thing that could not be undone. Nehima turned her head just enough to look at him, and in her eyes there was no distance now, no guarded edge, only a quiet recognition, as if she had finally found the answer to a question she had been carrying for a long time. And she gave a small nod, not dramatic, not emotional, just enough to mark the moment as real. And outside, beyond the cabin walls, the town continued to move slowly back into itself, unaware that what had changed would not fade with the passing of the day, because some things, once seen clearly, could never be unseen, no matter how hard a person tried to look away. The cabin held the quiet differently now, not empty, not tense, but settled, like a place that had accepted something it had not expected to carry. And Ethan Cole stood by the table with his hands resting against the worn wood, feeling the faint warmth left by the morning sun that slipped through the narrow window, while Nehima remained near that same window, her gaze tracing the distant line where the riders had disappeared, not searching for them, but acknowledging that they had been there at all. Outside, the town had begun to speak again, but softer, voices low, measured, as if every word now had to pass through a different kind of understanding before it could be said, and the usual sharp edges of judgment had dulled into something uncertain, something that did not yet know how to take shape. Ethan lifted his hat from the table and turned it slowly in his hands, not out of habit, but because the motion gave him a moment to think without needing to fill the silence with words. And after a while he set it back down, choosing stillness instead, because that was the language that had carried him this far. Nahima finally stepped away from the window, her movement quiet, deliberate, and she crossed the room without hesitation, not circling, not keeping distance, but moving with the kind of certainty that did not ask permission, and she stopped across from him, the space between them smaller now than it had been the night before, not because either of them had moved closer all at once, but because the weight that once stood between them had been lifted without either of them naming it. "They will come," she said, her voice calm, not warning, not predicting, simply stating what she knew, and Ethan met her gaze directly, not questioning, not resisting. "Some will," he answered, and there was no concern in his tone, only acceptance, because he had already lived long enough to know that people rarely stayed silent when something unsettled them deeply. Nahima's eyes held his for a moment longer, and then she gave a slight nod, not to confirm his words, but to acknowledge the path that now lay ahead of them both, and she turned toward the small shelf along the wall where a few simple items rested: a tin cup, a folded cloth, a knife worn from years of use. And she touched each one lightly, not claiming them, but recognizing them, as if learning the shape of a life that had just become part of her own. Outside, footsteps approached slowly, not hurried, not hidden, and Ethan's head tilted just slightly, listening, his body still relaxed, his posture unchanged, because whatever waited beyond that door would be met the same way everything else had been, without noise, without fear. The knock came soft, almost hesitant, a sound that did not belong to the men who had laughed the day before, and Ethan moved toward the door without urgency, his boots steady against the wooden floor. And when he opened it, the man from earlier stood there, hat in hand once more, his shoulders not as rigid now, his eyes not as guarded, and for a moment he did not speak, as if the words he had carried with him had lost their certainty along the way. Ethan did not press him, did not ask. He simply stood there, giving the space needed for whatever would come next. And after a breath, the man finally spoke, his voice low, careful. "We were wrong," he said, and this time the words did not sound small. They sounded honest, shaped by something that had taken root deeper than pride. Nahima stepped into view behind Ethan then, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing where she could be seen. And the man's eyes lifted to meet hers, not with doubt, not with challenge, but with a kind of respect he had not known how to offer before. And he lowered his head slightly, not as an act, but as something that came naturally now. Ethan glanced back toward Nahima for a brief second, not asking for permission, not seeking guidance, just acknowledging her presence. And then he turned back to the man, his voice steady, unchanged. "Then you see," he said, and the man gave a slow nod, the kind that carried more weight than anything else he could have said. And as he stepped back from the doorway, leaving the space as quietly as he had entered it, it became clear that what had begun outside in the open yard had now crossed into something deeper, something that would not fade with distance or time, because it had already begun to take hold where it mattered most. The door closed softly after the man stepped away, and the sound lingered in the cabin longer than it should have, like a mark left behind rather than a simple ending. And Ethan Cole stood there for a moment with his hands still resting on the wood, feeling the faint vibration fade beneath his palm, while outside the town continued its slow, uncertain return to movement, not the same as before, never quite the same again. Nahima did not move immediately, her eyes still fixed on the doorway as if measuring what had just passed through it. Not the man himself, but what he carried, what he had left behind without even knowing it. And after a long moment she stepped closer, her presence quiet but steady, until she stood beside Ethan again, not separate, not distant, but aligned in a way that did not need to be spoken. "It begins like this," she said softly, her voice carrying that same calm weight. it always held. And Ethan glanced toward her, not asking what she meant, because he already understood. The first man to return, the first to lower his voice instead of raising it, the first to admit what had been wrong without needing to be forced. And he gave a slight nod. One at a time, he answered, his tone simple, because that was how change came out here, not in waves, not in noise, but in quiet decisions made by men who had seen something they could not ignore. The light inside the cabin shifted as the sun climbed higher, stretching across the floor in long lines that reached toward the far wall, touching the small objects Nahima had noticed earlier, the cup, the cloth, the worn knife, and she moved toward them again, not out of curiosity, but with intention now, as if each item was part of something she was beginning to understand. And she picked up the cup, turning it slightly in her hand, feeling its weight, its balance, before setting it back down exactly where it had been, not changing anything, only learning it. Outside, another set of footsteps approached, slower than before, more cautious, and Ethan did not need to look to know what it meant. He simply waited, giving the moment the same space he had given the last. And the knock came again, just as soft, just as careful, and this time Nahima turned her head toward the door before he moved, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted that this would continue. Ethan opened the door once more, and a different figure stood there now, older, his face lined by years of sun and hard work, his hat held close against his chest, and he did not hesitate as long as the first man had. He spoke almost immediately, his voice low but clear. "I brought something," he said, and from behind him he lifted a small sack, worn but clean, the kind used to carry grain or flour, and he held it forward, not as payment, not as apology exactly, but as something offered in acknowledgement, something given because it felt right rather than required. Ethan looked at the sack, then at the man, and for a brief moment he said nothing, because he understood what this was, not a transaction, not a bargain, but a step, another small shift in a town that was learning how to stand differently, and he stepped aside just enough to make space, not fully inviting, not closing the door either, just leaving the choice open. The man hesitated, then placed the sack just inside the doorway, not crossing the threshold, not assuming he belonged there yet, and he gave a small nod, his eyes flickering briefly toward Nahima behind Ethan. And there was no fear there now, no uncertainty, only respect, quiet and unspoken. And then he stepped back, turning without another word, leaving the offering where it lay. Nahima watched him go, her gaze thoughtful, not surprised, not impressed, simply aware, and she stepped forward, kneeling slightly to touch the sack, her fingers brushing the fabric, feeling its weight, its purpose, and she looked up at Ethan, not asking, not questioning, but acknowledging what it meant. And Ethan met her gaze, his expression unchanged, his voice low. "They are learning," he said, and Nahima gave a small nod, her hand resting lightly on the sack for just a moment longer before she stood again. Because out here, learning did not come fast, it did not come easy, but once it began, it had a way of staying long after the moment that started had passed. The sack remained where it had been placed, simple, unremarkable at a glance, yet carrying more meaning than anything else in the room, and Nahima stood over it for a moment before lifting it carefully, not as a possession, but as something received with awareness, her hands steady, her movements deliberate, and she carried it to the table where the morning light now rested fully, laying it down beside the tin cup as if placing it into a story that had already begun to take shape. Ethan Cole watched without interruption, his posture relaxed but present, understanding that what was unfolding did not belong to him alone, and outside, the rhythm of footsteps did not fade. It grew, slow at first, then more certain, as if the quiet courage of one had given shape to another, and then another, until the space beyond the cabin began to fill not with noise, but with intention. The next knock came sooner, firmer this time, not loud, but no longer hesitant, and Ethan opened the door without delay. And there stood a woman this time, older, her hair pulled back, her hands holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and she did not lower her eyes when she spoke, though her voice carried a careful respect. "For the morning," she said, extending the bundle forward, and Ethan stepped aside just enough, the same way he had before, not inviting fully, not refusing, simply allowing. And she placed the bundle on the edge of the table inside, near the sack, her movements gentle, precise, and, when she straightened, her gaze moved to Nehema, not lingering, not searching, but acknowledging, as she gave a slight nod, not forced, not uncertain, and then turned and left without another word. Nehema watched her go, her expression unchanged, yet her eyes held a quiet understanding, as if she recognized the weight behind the gesture more than the gesture itself, and she moved to the bundle, unwrapping it slowly to reveal fresh bread, still warm, its scent rising softly into the air, mixing with the dry smell of wood and dust, bringing something new into the space, something human, something shared. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because he had seen towns change before, but never like this, never this quietly, never this honestly, and he rested his hand briefly against the table, grounding himself in the moment. The day moved forward, and with it came more footsteps, more quiet knocks, each one different, each one carrying its own weight, a small bag of grain, a piece of cloth, a handful of dried herbs, nothing extravagant, nothing meant to impress, only offerings shaped by sincerity, placed just inside the doorway and left without demand, without expectation, and with each one, the space within the cabin shifted, not cluttered but filled, layered with meaning that no single person could have forced into existence. Nehema moved among these small offerings with the same calm presence, touching each one briefly, acknowledging it, not as payment, not as apology, but as recognition. And Ethan remained nearby, not directing, not organizing, only standing within it, because he understood that this was not something to be controlled, it was something to be allowed. Outside, the town no longer stood at a distance, though no one crowded the yard. No one pressed too close, they remained where they were, watching, learning, each person carrying their own thoughts, their own shift, and the sound of the place itself changed, not louder, but fuller, as if the land had taken a deeper breath. Nehema finally stepped back from the table, her gaze moving slowly across the items now resting there. And then she looked to Ethan, her voice quiet, yet certain. "They are not giving to me," she said, and Ethan met her eyes, understanding already. "No," he answered, "they're giving to what they see now." And she gave a small nod, because that was the truth of it, the thing that could not be undone once it had been realized. The sun climbed higher still, casting stronger light through the window, illuminating the room in full, and in that light, nothing looked hidden anymore, nothing uncertain, only clear. And as the last knock of the morning faded into the distance, the cabin stood not as a place apart from the town, but as something connected to it in a way that had not existed before, something built not with words, not with force, but with quiet choices made one after another, until they became something real. The light inside the cabin did not shift much after midday. It settled into a steady glow that revealed everything without favor, every worn edge of wood, every quiet mark of use, every small offering placed with care, and Nehema stood before the table with her hands resting lightly against its surface, her gaze moving across what had been given, not counting, not measuring, only acknowledging, as if each item carried a voice that did not need to be heard aloud. Ethan Cole remained near the doorway, one shoulder leaning against the frame, his hat resting low over his eyes, not hiding, not distant, just present in the way he had always been, steady as the land beneath him. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, because the silence now was no longer something to fill, it was something to understand. Outside, the town had returned to its rhythm, but quieter, slower, as if every step taken now carried a thought that had not been there before. And though no one stood watching the cabin openly anymore, the space between them and that small piece of land felt different, not divided, not closed, but aware. Nehema reached for the piece of leather once more, lifting it gently from where it rested against her chest, and she held it in her palm, letting the light touch its worn surface, the edges softened by time, by memory, by something that had traveled farther than any road could carry. And she spoke, not loudly, not for the town, only for the space they shared. My mother said that what is given with truth will return, even if it must cross many seasons to find its way. And Ethan listened, his gaze lifting slightly beneath the brim of his hat, not questioning, not interrupting, because he understood that some words were not meant to be answered, only received. She closed her fingers around the leather, holding it close once more, and then she turned toward him fully, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, but her eyes carrying something new, something that no longer stood behind distance or guarded. Silence. You chose without knowing, she said, and Ethan straightened slightly, pushing away from the doorframe, his boots settling firm against the floor. I knew enough, he answered, his voice quiet, steady as always, and there was no need to explain further, because what he had known was not her past, not her story, but something simpler, something stronger, the truth of what stood before him in that moment. Nahima studied him for a brief second, not searching for doubt, not testing, only seeing, and then she gave a small nod, the kind that closed a question rather than opened one, and she moved past him toward the door, stepping out into the open light once more. Ethan followed a step behind, not leading, not guiding, just there, and together they stood at the edge of the porch, looking out across the land that now felt both familiar and changed, the same fences, the same dry grass, the same horizon stretching wide and open, yet holding something new beneath it all. The wind moved again, gentle this time, carrying the scent of dust and distant sage, brushing against them both like a quiet reminder that the land did not belong to one story alone. It held many, layered over time, waiting for those willing to see them. Nahima's gaze moved across the town, not with judgment, not with distance, but with a quiet acceptance of what it had been and what it might become. And she spoke one last time, her voice soft, yet certain. They will forget some of this, she said, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes following the same line of buildings. Most will, he agreed, because that was the way of people, the way of time. But after a brief pause he added, but not all. And she turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze once more, and in that moment there was no separation between them, no question left unanswered. Only a shared understanding that what had been set in motion would not disappear entirely, no matter how many tried to look away. The sun stood high, now, casting no shadows long enough to hide behind, and the world moved forward as it always did, but something had shifted beneath it, something quiet, something lasting, and as the two of them stood there in the open, side by side, it became clear that out here, where words were few and choices carried weight, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It arrived the way it always had, in the simple, stubborn act of a man choosing to stand beside what others refused to see, and in doing so, changing more than just his own life without ever needing to say a word about it.